Have you ever wondered why, in difficult situations, some people can remain calm and think clearly, while others are swept away by the smallest detail? The same pressure, the same circumstances, yet completely different reactions. Carl Jung believed that this difference does not lie in intelligence, experience, or surface-level composure, but in the psychological structure operating behind consciousness. People do not lose their calm because the situation is too overwhelming, but because invisible inner forces rise up faster than reason. We often believe that staying calm is a skill to be trained, and that thinking smart is the result of better logical reasoning. Jung, however, approached the issue from a different direction. He argued that in moments of tension, people rarely truly think. Most of the time, we are merely reacting from memory, from psychological habits, from structures formed long before the present situation ever appeared. When these structures take the wheel, you may still be able to argue, but your thinking is no longer free. Jung believed that only by understanding how the mind operates under pressure can you distinguish between reaction and genuine thought. This video does not aim to teach you how to suppress emotions or impose positive thinking onto difficult situations. It opens a different map, a Jungian map of the inner life, where staying calm is not a technique to practice, but the natural result of a psyche arranged in the right order. And within that map, thinking smart does not come from quick reactions or sharp arguments, but from the inner position from which you are thinking. Are you reacting from an old structure, or are you viewing the situation from a mind stable enough to truly understand it? Are you ready to step into that map? Number 1. The nature of stress, when the unconscious rises before reason. There are moments in life when you feel completely swept away without understanding why. A small remark is enough to make you lose your composure. An unexpected situation triggers tension you cannot control. You know you should stay calm, yet your body tightens, your heart races, and your thoughts become heavy and confused. What is frightening is not that emotions appear, but that you do not know where they come from. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." No sentence describes the essence of stress more clearly. We react before we think. And the loss of calm does not originate from logic, but from the unconscious, a hidden current flowing beneath every conscious experience we believe we control. From Jung's perspective, stress is not a malfunction, it is a signal. It is like a gentle knock from within, reminding you that something unseen and unnamed is quietly operating inside you. When you feel stressed, your body is not simply reacting to the present moment. It is reminding you of something much older, an experience, a memory, an unconscious lesson absorbed in childhood, in early relationships, from unhealed wounds, or from harsh expectations imposed by family or society. Losing calm, therefore, is not a failure of reason. It is the uprising of parts of the psyche you do not normally see. A simple metaphor helps illustrate this. Imagine a grand piano in a quiet room. You do not touch the keys, but if someone slams the door, the strings vibrate softly, producing a sound that no one intentionally created. Your unconscious functions like those strings. You do not choose to react strongly. You do not intend to lose your calm, but when a stimulus strikes the right string, the entire inner system resonates. That resonance is emotion. But the strings vibrate not because of the present moment, They vibrate because of an existing internal structure. This is how Jung explains why stress can arise even in situations you believe you can control. It is not the situation that causes stress, but the unconscious strings reacting first. To see this more clearly, consider a real-life example. A man named Jonathan, calm, polite, and professionally successful in the media industry. Everyone thinks Jonathan is the type who remains composed in all circumstances. Yet there is one thing that quickly makes him lose control: when someone points out a mistake. A colleague merely says, "You missed this detail," and Jonathan immediately feels his chest tighten, his face heat up, and a familiar thought echoes in his mind: "I failed." He knows this reaction is irrational, knows that everyone makes mistakes, yet logic cannot soften it. Each time he asks himself, why does a small comment feel like an attack? Through therapy, Jonathan realized that his emotions did not belong to the present. As a child, he grew up in a strict household where mistakes were not simply corrected, but treated as proof of inadequacy. His father equated perfection with worth, saying things like, "Men are not allowed to make mistakes," or "If you fail, you shame the family." For a child, these were not mere criticisms. They became belief structures, unconscious strings that vibrated whenever a similar stimulus appeared. As an adult, Jonathan was not reacting to his colleague. He was reacting to his father's voice echoing from memory. He was not afraid of the current mistake. He was afraid of being seen as worthless, a fear decades old. This reveals the true nature of stress. It is the meeting point between the present moment and your psychological history. And critical thinking, intelligent reasoning in difficult situations, cannot occur unless you can separate the two. If you mistake unconscious reactions for present reality, you will believe you are evaluating the situation, while in fact, you are evaluating the past. You will make decisions based on old fear rather than clear perception. You will lose calm, not because of danger, but because of memory. This leads to an important insight. To think clearly, you must see through your first reaction. That reaction does not speak about the situation. It speaks about you, about what you once feared, learned, endured, or were wounded by. Jung believed the unconscious never disappears. It only hides until activated. Each time you lose calm, it signals that an unconscious part is rising toward consciousness, asking to be acknowledged and understood. And if you listen rather than resist, you discover what critical thinking truly needs: distance between you and the reaction, between the present and memory. There is something else intriguing about stress. It distorts time. When the unconscious surfaces, you are not only reacting to the present, you are reacting as if the past were repeating itself. You feel pushed back into childhood, compelled to respond in old ways, as though you have no choice. This moment is often described as, "I don't know why I did that," or "I knew it wasn't right, but I couldn't control myself." In that instant, the unconscious moved ahead of reason. Jung believed this is the true beginning of inner development. The moment you realize your reaction is not you, but the story you carry. Notice what your body does under stress: clenched jaw, tightened fists, shallow breath, racing heart. These are not irrational behaviors. The body remembers what you experienced long before the mind could analyze it. Sometimes the body remembers more accurately than you do. A careless remark, a glance, a change in tone, all can trigger bodily reactions faster than conscious thought. This is the biological imprint of the unconscious that Jung described. When the body reacts before thought, sharp thinking disappears. And to restore it, you must do something few expect. Listen to the body before trying to reason. The remarkable thing is that once you understand how the unconscious works, stress becomes less frightening. It becomes a language you can read. Each time you react strongly, instead of believing you failed, you understand. An old part of me has been activated. This is not the present. That awareness creates enough inner space for reason to return. And this is precisely where staying calm and thinking smart intersect. Calm emerges when you no longer misunderstand your emotions, and intelligence emerges when you no longer allow the unconscious to decide for you. Before continuing, take a few seconds to ask yourself, in your life, how many stress reactions truly come from today, and how many come from yesterday? If you are ready to look deeper for the answer, continue with me into the next part. Number 2. The core difference. Calm not equal to suppression. There is a common misunderstanding. Suppression is not calm. Yet in daily life, the two are so easily confused that many people believe they are calm, when in fact they are simply pushing emotions inward so no one can see them. Suppression does not eliminate emotion. It forces it deeper into the mind, where it continues to accumulate without being processed. And precisely when you believe you are fine, your inner world is moving in the opposite direction. Carl Jung wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. What you fight against does not disappear. It grows stronger, quieter, and more powerful until it exceeds your ability to control it. What is suppressed does not stop. It develops and waits for the right moment to re-emerge." Calm, in the Jungian sense, does not mean the absence of emotion. It means emotions have a place to exist. It does not require you to analyze the unconscious or practice mindfulness or apply sophisticated techniques. It requires only one thing. When emotion arises, you do not silence it. Calm is not an action. It is an inner state in which emotions are acknowledged without being mistaken for your identity. If suppression is telling yourself, "I'm fine," true calm is knowing, "I have emotions, and I still have space to deal with them." This is why genuinely calm people appear to stand one step back from their emotions. They do not force silence. They simply do not let emotions occupy the entire room. Imagine a small room with an old cabinet. Each time an uncomfortable emotion appears, fear, anger, sadness, you open the cabinet, shove it inside, and slam the door shut. At first, the cabinet holds. Over time, however, you feel a faint vibration each time the door closes. Eventually, a minor trigger, a slightly wrong tone of voice, an awkward silence, causes the door to burst open, releasing everything you have stored inside. That explosion is not caused by the present situation. It is the result of countless acts of suppression. This is the subtle yet crucial difference between holding in and staying calm. One builds pressure, the other creates space. A viewer named Lena shared that she was always described as nice, easygoing, and considerate. She never raised her voice, never showed discomfort, never said outright when she felt hurt. Her friends believed this was calmness. The reality was very different. One day, while dining with friends, someone joked about Lena's appearance. Everyone laughed. Lena laughed too. But on the way home, her chest felt heavy, her breathing shallow, her face flushed, and an unnamed sense of tightness appeared. She could not understand why such a normal moment triggered such a strong reaction? What Lena did not realize was that she was not calm. She was suppressing. She did not allow herself to respond honestly, did not allow emotion to exist in shared space, so it had to find another path, through the body. Her shoulders tightened, her steps grew heavy, her breathing fractured. When emotions are not acknowledged, the body carries what the mind refuses. Over time, this becomes fatigue, anxiety, or unexplained irritation. People like Lena do not lose control loudly. They lose it silently. The core difference is this. Suppression tries to eliminate emotion to appear calm. Genuine calm gives emotion space so thinking can remain clear. One person is silent, the other is internally settled. These are often mistaken for each other, and this confusion causes people to misjudge their capacity for critical thinking. When you are suppressed, your mind is not free to think intelligently. It is busy guarding the door. Don't react, don't show, don't let them see. In that state, you cannot see situations as they are. You see them through the filter of compressed tension. When emotions are not allowed, thinking becomes distorted without your awareness. Think back to times when you reacted excessively after long periods of emotional restraint. Have you ever cried over something trivial? Felt irritated by a remark that normally would not bother you? Felt unusually sensitive during periods when you had to keep appearances or stay composed? These moments are not weakness. They are signs of an inner world that no longer has space to breathe. Suppression is like pushing a ball underwater. It stays down briefly, but the deeper you push, the more forcefully it wants to rise. And when it does, its power often surprises you. True calm is the opposite. It is like letting the ball float on the surface. It remains there, visible, but harmless. It is not hidden or compressed. You see it, accept it, and therefore it does not control you. Critical thinking requires inner space. If emotions are forced down, thinking is forced down with them. The mind needs room to ask questions, to consider perspectives, to choose the most intelligent response. When emotions are compressed, choice disappears. Only reflexes remain. Another crucial point. Suppression affects not only emotions, but memory and judgment. Holding something down requires constant mental effort. Energy that should be used for clarity is spent guarding the swelling cabinet door. This is why suppressed individuals are not wrong because they are weak or emotional. They are mistaken because they misunderstood themselves. They believe they are calm when they are merely silent. True calm does not require control, it requires permission. Remember this. Truly calm people do not try to be calm. They are calm because they have nothing to fight. They do not battle emotion or perform strength. They live with emotion as they live with weather. Knowing rain is not a danger, and sunshine is not a reward. When emotion is no longer treated as something to avoid, it loses its power to dominate you. You see the situation, the people, and your own thoughts more clearly. Ask yourself one simple question. The last time you were calm, was it real calm, or were you tightening around something you did not dare to feel? If you want to enter genuine critical thinking, you cannot keep confusing these two. Because from here on, we move beyond emotion and into a deeper structure of the mind, one that Jung believed organizes all thought around a center, the ego. Number 3, the structure of the psyche, when the ego loses order. When discussing critical thinking in difficult moments, people often think of reasoning techniques, analytical methods, or observation skills. For Carl Jung, however, sharp thinking under pressure does not depend on technique, but on a foundational question. Who is thinking within you? If you want to stay calm in order to think smart, you must understand the structure of the mind that generates your thoughts. And for Jung, all answers begin with the core element of the psyche, the ego. In Jungian psychology, the ego is not arrogance or inflated self-importance. It is simply the center of consciousness, the psychological spine that allows you to orient yourself. Who am I? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? Where am I within this experience? If the unconscious is an ocean, the ego is the vessel that keeps you afloat and steers direction. When that vessel loses order, both calm and coherent thinking immediately weaken. Not because you lack intelligence, but because the structure of the mind is unstable. Observe your own life, and you will see this clearly. Some days you are calm, lucid, and decisive. Other days everything feels confused, even though external circumstances have not changed. The difference lies not in the world, but in the stability of your ego. When the ego is stable, thinking feels like standing on solid ground. When the ego is loose, thinking feels like standing on a slanted floor. Every argument slides, every conclusion warps. A weakened ego resembles a homeowner overwhelmed by noisy guests. Consciousness loses command and is pulled along by inner currents. In that state, staying calm is difficult and thinking smart is nearly impossible. A powerful illustration of the ego appears in Greek mythology, in Odysseus's journey home to Ithaca. When passing the sirens, whose songs drove sailors mad and onto the rocks, Odysseus survived not through strength, but through understanding the limits of the human mind. He bound himself to the mast, keeping the ego, conscious awareness, anchored at the center. This is the essence of staying calm and thinking smart. Calm does not mean the absence of temptation. It means the ego remains centered amid emotional chaos. Modern neuroscience echoes this insight through research on executive function, the cognitive processes responsible for reasoning, planning, and self-awareness. The prefrontal cortex, which governs these functions, closely mirrors the role of the ego in Jung's model. When it operates well, emotional and intuitive information is organized coherently. When overwhelmed by the limbic system, thinking becomes distorted. Focus weakens, extremes increase, judgment falters. In simple terms, when the ego's machinery overloads, thought itself destabilizes. In daily life, people rarely notice when their ego loses order. They only see symptoms: looping thoughts, memory gaps, exaggerated interpretations, difficulty seeing the whole picture. A day may begin with a strong sense of self-control, but a small psychological trigger, a phrase, an unexpected event, a vague memory, can tilt the ego. When that happens, thinking becomes driven by fear, habit, and unresolved memory. This is not emotion. It is structural misalignment. And when the foundation tilts, everything built upon it tilts too. Jung emphasized that the ego is not static. It is an ongoing organizing process. Like a conductor, it coordinates inner voices. When the conductor stands firm, harmony follows. When the conductor steps aside, chaos emerges. Inner contents are not malicious, they are simply uncoordinated. And without coordination, calm and clarity vanish. When the ego loses its position, the The first ability to collapse is the distinction between present thought and past content. These layers merge, distorting perception. You believe you are analyzing reality, but you are reacting through old patterns. When the ego is stable, you recognize this. When it is not, you lose awareness of the source of your thoughts. And without knowing who is thinking, critical thinking cannot exist. In moments of ego displacement, people swing between extremes, thinking too fast or too slow. Rapid thinking jumps to conclusions. Slow thinking sinks into confusion. This is not emotional weakness. It is disorganization. A mind without a center is like a wheel with a bent axle, intact, but unstable. It is crucial to say this clearly. The ego is not the enemy. Popular spirituality often preaches, destroy the ego. Jung strongly disagreed. Without ego, you cannot choose, reflect, or take responsibility. Calm is the result of an ordered ego. Clarity arises from an ego with boundaries. A strong ego is not a large ego, it is a clear one. Understanding this explains much of life. Some people do not listen, they hear only echoes of themselves. Some overreact, not from fragility, but because unorganized content has overtaken their center. Even you may recall moments when you felt not yourself. That is the ego stepping away from command. If, at this point, you recall a moment when your reactions felt unlike you, when your thinking blurred or something unseen guided you, share it in the comments. You do not need to analyze it. Sometimes, simply naming the moment when the ego lost its place becomes a quiet but profound point of connection for others walking the same path. Number 4. The origin of emotion. Emotion as the language of the unconscious. When the ego's instability makes calm fragile and thinking distorted, a natural question arises. Where does this disruption come from? Jung's answer lies not in circumstance or logic, but in emotion, not as something to eliminate, but as a language spoken from the deepest layers of the mind. People often view emotion as a reaction. Jung saw it as a signal. Emotion does not arise randomly or maliciously. It is a living symbol sent upward from the unconscious to indicate that something inside requires attention. Anxiety, anger, shame, sadness, these are not intrusions. They are messages. The problem is not emotion itself, but whether you understand its language. Treat emotion as an enemy, and you will try to silence it. Treat it as language, and you begin to listen, and in that moment, true calm becomes possible. The unconscious does not communicate through logic, but through images, symbols, and sensations. Emotion is its fastest entry point into consciousness. It does not send reports, it sends states. When discomfort appears in a seemingly harmless conversation, it is not because the conversation is wrong, but because the unconscious recognizes a familiar pattern, an unresolved memory, an old wound. Emotion is like a warning light on a dashboard. Covering the light does not fix the engine. Reading it does. The unconscious is like a dark room behind a stage where technicians adjust lights and sound. Consciousness is the lit stage where action unfolds. When everything works, you forget the room behind. But when something shifts backstage, the stage flickers. Emotion is that flicker. It is not sabotage, it is communication. This explains why emotions precede thought in difficult moments. The unconscious works through recognition, not reasoning. A look, a tone, a pause, these can trigger old content instantly. If you do not understand this language, you believe you are reacting to now. If you do, you realize something deeper is being referenced. Imagine a family dinner where a woman casually says she prefers to stay home instead of attending a familiar gathering. Silence falls for a few seconds before the conversation moves on. No conflict, no criticism. Yet in that brief silence, her body reacts. Chest heavy, breath shallow, an unnamed discomfort. Nothing happened, yet something was felt. From a Jungian perspective, this emotion is not oversensitivity. It is a signal. The unconscious detected hesitation in the room and translated it into sensation. By recognizing the signal without justification or retreat, she remains calm. Jung wrote, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious. Without emotion, the unconscious has no doorway into awareness. Every strong emotion is therefore an opportunity, a chance to understand inner structure. Reject the opportunity, and you lose both insight and calm." Understanding emotion as language does not require constant analysis or therapy. It requires a shift in attitude. Instead of asking, "How do I stop this feeling?" ask, "What is this feeling saying?" That single question transforms your relationship with emotion. You move from resistance to listening. And when listened to, emotion often softens, not because it was suppressed, but because it was acknowledged. Critical thinking fails not because you feel, but because you misunderstand the feeling. When emotion is unrecognized, it dominates. When recognized as a signal, it steps back. The ego returns to center. Thought resumes. Calm, in Jung's sense, is not emptiness but order. Emotion has a place, but not control. Like a letter on a desk, it can be read, but it does not write the story for you. When you read the letter, you know where you stand and can respond to the present, not the past. So when emotion appears in difficult moments, do not assume you are losing control. You may be drawing closer to yourself. Paradoxically, by listening to emotion as language, calm emerges. Not because the waves vanish, but because you learn to read the current. Number 5. Shadow. Hidden motives that govern thinking. But recognizing emotions as silent messages from within only opens the first door. At a deeper level, a crucial question emerges. Who stands behind those signals, and what has quietly distorted your thinking without consciousness realizing it in time? At this point, Carl Jung introduces a key concept: the shadow. Not as something evil or pathological, but as unconscious motives that have never been confronted, silently governing the way you think, judge, and choose, especially in difficult situations. The shadow is not emotion, nor is it a crisis. It is what you have learned not to see in yourself. It may be ambition you deny in order to appear humble, a need for recognition you hide out of fear of being seen as selfish, or competitiveness you reject by calling yourself unconcerned. The shadow does not disappear simply because you refuse to name it. When buried, it does not rest. It changes how it appears. And the way it most often appears is through distorted thinking that you believe to be completely reasonable. The danger of the shadow lies here. When it is activated, you do not feel controlled. You feel that you are thinking logically. Jung pointed out that people are rarely driven by desires they are conscious of. They are driven by motives they believe they do not have. The shadow operates precisely in that blind spot. It makes you believe your conclusions are objective, while in reality, your thinking is serving a buried motive you have never acknowledged. Consider the story of a man who always sees himself as calm and non-competitive. In discussions, he often says that winning or losing doesn't matter, that it's enough if everything is fine. But whenever someone else presents an idea that attracts more attention, he immediately begins analyzing it carefully to point out weaknesses, risks, or impracticalities. On the surface, he appears thoughtful and cautious, but on closer inspection, what is operating is not pure critical thinking, but an unacknowledged shadow, a need for recognition, and a fear of being overshadowed. Because he does not allow himself to recognize that need, the shadow finds another path to speak through arguments, analysis, and apparent reasonableness. And at that moment, his thinking is already distorted without his awareness. This is the point Jung emphasized most strongly. The shadow does not make you irrational in a loud way. It makes you believe you are being very rational. You do not lose your temper, you lose inner honesty. When the shadow takes control, you do not react impulsively. You build an entire system of reasoning to defend what you do not dare to see. And so, critical thinking fails not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of a lack of confrontation. To understand this more clearly, imagine the shadow as a hidden engine mounted beneath the floor. You cannot see it, but it makes the floor vibrate. You walk and believe you are choosing your direction, while in reality, the path has already been tilted by forces below. When the shadow is unrecognized, all thinking tends to slide in its service. You are not wrong in logic, you are wrong in the starting point. And when the starting point is skewed, every conclusion carries a subtle distortion. There is a story often told in Zen tradition. A monk and his student walk through a forest. The student repeatedly asks, "How can I avoid being controlled by wandering thoughts?" The master does not answer. When they reach a stream, the master stops and points to the muddy water that has just been stirred. He says, "Look, when the water is stirred, you cannot see the bottom. The more you stir it, the murkier it becomes. Only when you stop does it settle." The shadow works the same way. When you try to prove that you do not have certain motives, you are stirring the water. When you stop and look directly at what you do not want to acknowledge, thinking finally has a chance to become clear. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The shadow does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be seen, and the act of seeing it is the foundation of sharp thinking in difficult situations. It is important to clarify this. Confronting the shadow does not mean becoming negative or self-blaming. It simply means accepting that you are not driven only by the noble motives you are willing to admit. When you dare to look at buried motives, control, the need for recognition, rivalry, fear of losing position, the shadow loses its power to operate from the dark. It does not disappear, but it no longer has to manipulate your thinking. In difficult situations, the shadow often appears in the form of reasonable arguments. You may suddenly feel strangely certain that others are wrong, that you are right, that there is no other option. Jung warned that this is the most dangerous sign. Because when thinking becomes too certain, too rigid, the shadow is likely holding the steering wheel. Critical thinking does not require doubting everything, but it does require doubting the motive driving your thinking. When the shadow is recognized, a subtle shift occurs. You no longer need to defend your image with arguments. You no longer need to prove yourself right at all costs. Thinking becomes softer and more flexible, not because you are weaker, but because you are no longer being controlled from behind. The ego no longer has to protect the shadow and can return to its coordinating role. And it is here that stay calm and think smart meet again, not through control, but through deep honesty with oneself. If you look back at moments when your thinking went astray, you will likely see that the problem was not information or intelligence. It lay in parts of you that had been ignored for too long, forced to speak through thought. The shadow does not destroy you. It refuses to be denied. And when you dare to face it, you not only regain calm, but reclaim sovereignty over your thinking, something Jung saw as the foundation of a conscious life. From here on, the question is no longer, how can I think correctly, but which motive in me wants to think this way? And only when you dare to ask that question does thinking become truly free. Number 6. Jungian critical thinking. Recognizing who is thinking in me. If in the previous sections we have seen how the unconscious disrupts calm, how suppression distorts thinking, and how a disordered ego tilts perception, here Jung brings us to a more subtle, quieter, yet decisive operation. The ability to distinguish the source of thought, not whether a thought is right or wrong, but where it is being spoken from within the psyche. For Jung, critical thinking is not sharper reasoning, but the capacity to recognize the voice speaking inside you. Carl Jung believed that people rarely think from a single center. Most of the time, we live in the illusion that I am thinking, while in reality, consciousness is merely the stage on which different voices step forward in turn. Sometimes the ego speaks, sometimes a complex takes over, and sometimes the shadow whispers from behind, borrowing the language of reason to conceal its motives. If you cannot distinguish these three sources, you may think a great deal, quickly, logically, intensely, yet never think freely. The ego, in a healthy state, always carries a sense of distance. When the ego is thinking, you feel that you are observing the thought rather than being carried away by it. The thought can be questioned, revised, or temporarily set aside. The ego does not need immediate certainty. It allows ambiguity to exist. This capacity to tolerate incompleteness is the clearest sign of critical thinking. A stable ego does not rush to conclusions. It prioritizes proper orientation. By contrast, when a complex is operating, thinking has a very different quality. It often carries a familiar, repetitive tone and strongly resists being questioned. A complex does not ask. It asserts. It does not explore. It imposes. Jung described complexes as semi-autonomous sub-personalities within the psyche, each carrying its own history, beliefs, and logic. When a complex speaks, you do not feel that you are considering. You feel that you are recalling something long known, even when the present context is entirely different. The shadow is more subtle still. It rarely speaks in a clear voice. It often borrows the voice of reason, morality, or correctness. When the shadow operates, you feel objective, lucid, justified. And precisely because of this, the shadow is the most dangerous enemy of critical thinking. Not because it is irrational, but because it is too rational. It does not take away your ability to think. It takes away your ability to question yourself. Jung warned that where people are most certain, they are often least free. A thought that does not allow itself to be questioned almost certainly does not come from the ego. It comes from a structure that wants to be protected, maintained, unseen. As Jung wrote, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Therefore, the task of Jungian critical thinking is not to argue with such thoughts, but to recognize this is not the ego speaking. To see this distinction in real life, consider Albert Einstein. Einstein was not famous for thinking faster than others, but for his ability to hold a question open for a long time without rushing to close it. For years, he carried paradoxes about light, time, and space without resolving them. In his letters, Einstein said he did not try to defeat problems with intelligence, but simply lived with the question long enough. This was not emotional genius, but an exceptionally stable ego, a center of awareness not pressured to conclude in order to protect image or intellectual identity. Einstein could allow multiple inner voices to coexist without letting them seize control. At the level of modern neuroscience, Jung's description aligns closely with the concept of metacognition, the ability to recognize and monitor one's own thinking processes. Research shows that people with strong metacognition do not necessarily have superior memory or processing speed, but they can distinguish between the content of thought and the source of thought. Neurologically, this involves medial prefrontal networks and self-referential regions that allow one not only to think, but to know where one is thinking from. This is what Jung symbolically described as the ego maintaining an observing position rather than being pulled into service by other structures. A subtle sign of the ego's presence is flexibility of position. When the ego is operating, you can move from assertion to doubt, from certainty to curiosity, from defense to observation. A complex cannot do this. It follows a fixed trajectory. The shadow resists movement even more. It needs rigidity to remain hidden. Therefore, whenever your thinking becomes rigid, unable to shift perspective, intolerant of, maybe I haven't seen everything, it is time to pause, not to think more, but to ask, who is thinking in me right now? The core of Jungian critical thinking lies here. It does not fight complexes or the shadow, nor does it attempt to eliminate them. Jung did not believe in cleansing the mind. He believed in restoring order. When the ego stands at the center, complexes can be seen as complexes, the shadow recognized as shadow. They do not disappear, but they no longer impersonate me. A person with a stable ego does not need to win in thought. They do not need to be right. They only need to know where they stand in relation to the thought. This creates the inner freedom Jung saw as the prerequisite for a conscious life. At its deepest level, critical thinking is not analytical skill, but the capacity not to be possessed by unnamed structures. When you begin practicing recognition of inner voices, something strange happens. Thinking slows down, yet becomes sharper. It becomes more precise because it no longer serves to protect identity, image, or buried motives. The ego no longer needs to win. It only needs to see. And when it sees clearly, you are no longer swept into automatic conclusions. Jung said that people do not become free by having nobler thoughts, but by knowing what is controlling them. When you realize that a thought is not you, you gain distance. With distance comes choice. And with choice, thinking becomes thinking rather than reflex. At this level, stay calm is no longer a state to achieve, but the natural consequence of an unoccupied ego. Think smart is no longer about speed or sharpness, but about thinking from the right position. The central question of this entire section is not, "What should I think?" but "Who is thinking of me right now?" That single question already begins to shift the entire structure of thought. If this section helped you notice something small yet profoundly real, that thinking is not only about what you think, but about who is thinking in you, press like on the video. Not merely to support the content, but as a marker that you touched that moment of recognition. Sometimes, such a gentle pause is enough for the ego to return to its proper place, and from there, both calm and clarity begin to emerge on their own. Number 7. A practical story. When a man believes he is thinking very logically. When a person no longer questions the origin of their own thinking, thought begins to operate smoothly, and with that smoothness comes the risk of deviation. There are moments in working life when everything appears orderly on the surface, while beneath, direction quietly shifts. The story of this man begins with precisely such a moment. He was not agitated, not confused, not hesitant, yet the results he produced increasingly drifted away from the reality he believed he was controlling. The man's name was Marcus. He was a mid-level manager in a large corporation, having worked there for more than 15 years. Marcus was not talkative, nor the type of leader who sought attention. In meetings, he listened carefully, took notes, and spoke only after sufficient thought. Colleagues described him as very rational, sharp-minded, and not emotionally driven. Marcus believed this about himself. He was proud of making decisions based on data, procedures, and proven methods. To him, this was the sign of a strong ego, knowing what he was doing, knowing why he was doing it, and remaining unmoved by subjective factors. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Marcus's plans were clear. Goals were specific. Procedures were strictly followed. But over time, signs of instability appeared. The most talented team members began transferring departments or leaving the company. Projects dragged on longer than expected despite no major setbacks. The team became cautious, less innovative, less proactive. The working atmosphere grew so safe, it became suffocating. Marcus looked at all this and saw no issue with his thinking. To him, this was simply natural selection. Those who could not meet high standards would leave, and the system would stabilize. Notably, Marcus did not make irrational decisions. Each decision was explainable. Each choice had clear justification. When a team member proposed a new approach, Marcus asked about risks. When he heard a creative idea, he asked about control. And almost every time the conclusion was the same. We don't yet have sufficient grounds to change. No one could directly refute this logic, but no one felt truly heard. Meetings gradually became places to confirm decisions already made. Here, the Jungian question becomes crucial, even if no one names it aloud. Who is thinking in Marcus? On the surface, it sounds like a rational, careful, responsible ego. But the more closely one looks, the clearer it becomes that this voice allows no challenge. It does not open questions, it closes them. And this is the first sign that thinking no longer comes from the central ego, but from another structure that needs protection. Marcus was particularly uncomfortable working with independently influential people. He disliked individuals with strong voices who could draw the group's attention, not because they were wrong, but because they were difficult to control. Rather than opposing them directly, Marcus used proper arguments to limit their role, requiring more detailed reports, stricter adherence to procedure, or labeling them as undisciplined. Beneath the logic, a recurring pattern emerged. Anything not fully within his control was seen as a risk. Here, the power shadow begins to take shape, not as overt anger or ambition, but as a need to maintain position absolutely. This shadow never says, "I fear losing power." It speaks the language of reason. This isn't efficient. This hasn't been proven. We need more safety. And because that language sounds so rational, Marcus never realizes that the shadow answers first, while the ego arrives later to legitimize the answer with arguments. The most subtle aspect of this case lies in the fact that Marcus truly believes he is thinking logically. He does not see himself as impulsive. He does not feel threatened. Everything in his mind appears coherent, consistent, and contradiction-free. But this smoothness makes his thinking dangerous, because thinking that never questions its own origin is rarely free. It is thinking in service of a structure that must be maintained. From Jungian perspective, the true ego always retains the ability to question itself. It can pause and ask, "Am I seeing broadly enough? Is there something I do not want to see?" The shadow does not do this. The shadow needs certainty. The shadow needs closed answers. And when the shadow wears the mask of the ego, critical thinking turns into defensive thinking. Arguments no longer seek to understand reality, but to preserve existing structure. The consequences do not appear immediately. They spread through small choices. Marcus does not realize that each time he chooses safety over dialogue, each time he eliminates uncertainty instead of exploring it, his system contracts a little more. The team does not lose motivation because it is oppressed, but because there is no longer space to think with him. Creative people do not leave because they are treated badly, but because they sense that their thinking has no place in a locked structure. Here, critical thinking fails not because Marcus lacks intelligence. On the contrary, he is highly intelligent. The failure lies in the fact that the one steering thought is not the central ego, but the power shadow. And when the shadow drives, every decision, no matter how reasonable, will aim to protect position rather than engage with a changing reality. Marcus's story is not meant to judge him as right or wrong. It reveals something far more subtle. In difficult situations, intelligent thinking depends not only on the quality of arguments, but on who is allowed to think. When the ego is no longer central, when the shadow quietly answers instead, logic becomes a shield rather than a tool of perception. And at that point, a person may appear very certain and very calm on the surface, yet drift farther and farther from the capacity to think smart in the true Jungian sense. From here, the question to hold is no longer, is this argument correct, but a deeper, quieter one. Which structure in me needs this thinking to exist? When that question appears, thinking has a chance to return to the true ego. And only when the ego returns to the center does calm cease to be a facade and become the foundation for a flexible, living, and freer intelligence in the most difficult situations. Number 8. Complexes. When a complex takes the wheel of consciousness. But not every deviation in thinking begins with motives of power or easily recognizable impulses. There are times when consciousness slips off its course simply because it enters a familiar inner territory that has existed for a very long time. Jung called this structure a complex. A complex is not a fleeting thought. nor a momentary emotion. It is more like a cluster of memories, beliefs, and reflexes that have fused together over time, forming a kind of gravitational zone within the psyche. When you are outside that zone, you can think relatively neutrally, flexibly, and openly. But when a situation touches the complex directly, the entire thinking system immediately shifts trajectory. You still think, still analyze, still reason, but the point of departure is no longer neutral. And what is crucial is this: you are usually unaware of the moment that shift occurs. Jung described complexes as little personalities living inside the psyche. They are not loud, not constantly present, but when activated, they can take control of consciousness almost completely. At that point, thinking is no longer a tool for understanding reality, but becomes a means of serving the internal logic of the complex. You are not thinking wrongly in a naive sense. You are thinking very consistently, but consistently within a world already distorted from within. Imagine your consciousness as a boat moving across a calm lake. Normally, you hold the helm, observe the water, and adjust direction. But in certain areas of the lake, there are hidden whirlpools. When the boat enters one, you still hold the helm and feel as though you are steering, yet the pull beneath has already begun to drag your course off-center. Complexes function like those whirlpools. They do not exist everywhere, but when encountered, they quietly remove your neutrality, even though everything appears normal on the surface. What makes complexes particularly dangerous for critical thinking is that they do not destroy the capacity to think, they appropriate it. When a complex is activated, you do not become less intelligent. On the contrary, you often become sharper, faster, more certain. But that sharpness serves to reinforce a conclusion that has already been set. Jung noted that complexes can blind consciousness, not by extinguishing reason, but by directing reason along a closed circuit. In the Bible, there is a brief story with remarkable psychological depth, the story of King Saul. Saul was chosen as the first king of Israel, initially humble, hesitant, even hiding when called before the people. But over time, as power and responsibility grew, Saul became increasingly preoccupied with his position. When David appeared, loved and praised by the people, Saul did not immediately lose his mind or act impulsively. He continued to think, to plan, to justify his decisions with seemingly reasonable logic. Yet from that moment on, all of Saul's actions revolved around an invisible axis, protecting his position. A power and threat complex took control of his consciousness. Saul no longer saw David as a person, but as a danger. And precisely because Saul believed he was acting for the good of the kingdom, the tragedy became so profound. What is striking in this story is not the extreme behavior, but the earlier phase when Saul still appeared rational. The complex did not make him mad at once. It made him no longer neutral. Every piece of information, every signal was interpreted in a single direction. Critical thinking did not disappear. It was locked into a self-reinforcing loop. In modern life, complexes rarely take on the dramatic form seen in Scripture, but the mechanism is the same. A person with a complex around personal worth becomes highly sensitive to any sign of evaluation. Someone with a safety complex tends to interpret all change as risk. Someone with a control complex is quick to label unpredictability as unprofessional or irrational. When these complexes are triggered, thinking immediately loses neutrality even though it remains coherent on the surface. Jung emphasized that complexes do not need to be negative to cause problems. They only need to be strong and unconscious enough. When a complex takes the wheel, you are no longer asking, "Is this correct?" but implicitly asking, "Does this fit my familiar inner axis?" And because the second question usually remains unconscious, you believe you are evaluating objectively, while in fact, you are reacting from a structure that was programmed long ago. The key point here is this: complexes do not exist to sabotage you. They form to help you adapt, to protect a certain inner order in the past. But when circumstances change, if the complex continues to drive, thinking will no longer align with reality. It is like using an old map for a city that has already changed. You are not wrong to read the map. You are simply reading it at the wrong time. Therefore, in difficult situations, the ability to stay calm, think smart, does not depend on whether you have more information, but on whether you recognize that you have entered the pull of a complex. When neutrality is lost, critical thinking cannot truly function, because it has already been pulled off course at the starting point. Jung said that psychological freedom does not come from eliminating unconscious structures, but from recognizing when they are active. He warned bluntly, "Everyone knows nowadays that people have complexes. What is not so well known, though far more important theoretically, is that complexes can have us. Complexes do not need to be destroyed, they need to be seen. Only when you realize that something in me has just been triggered, does consciousness have a chance to return to the position of observer rather than being dragged along. And in that very moment, thinking gradually regains the neutrality it needs to truly understand the situation at hand. When complexes are no longer sitting behind the wheel, you do not become emotionless or cold. You become freer in how you think. You can receive information without immediately labeling it, consider multiple possibilities without needing to defend a familiar conclusion. This is not a weakening of stance, but a maturation of consciousness. And at the deepest level, this is what Jung believed made a person capable of clear thinking in difficult circumstances, not because they have no complexes, but because they do not allow complexes to quietly think on their behalf. Number 9. Psychological crisis, a sign of the restructuring of the self. There comes a point in inner life when thinking no longer quietly drifts off course, but comes to a complete halt, as if the entire inner system is forced to cut power. What once operated smoothly suddenly loses meaning, and the ways of thinking that once allowed you to control situations no longer work. It is precisely at this threshold that what we call crisis appears, not as a random malfunction, but as a sign that the psyche is entering a deeper phase of restructuring. In Jung's view, the psychological crisis is not simply collapse, it is the moment when an old structure of the self can no longer contain the contents that have been suppressed, avoided, or prolonged for too long. When these structures can no longer maintain order, they must dissolve to make room for another order. What makes a crisis frightening is not its meaninglessness, but the fact that it forces you to abandon definitions of yourself that once provided safety. In real life, crises rarely arrive in cinematic dramas. It usually appears quietly. A person once seen as stable, reliable, logical, suddenly realizes they can no longer function as before. Not because of incapacity, nor because of a specific event, but because every decision becomes strangely heavy. The person still goes to work, still fulfills responsibilities, but inside, there is a sense of trying to operate a machine that has lost its map. What once felt right no longer convinces, yet nothing new has formed to replace it. This is the typical Jungian crisis, not loud, not explosive, but deep enough to force the psyche to stop. Jung believed that when a crisis occurs, what is failing is not the self, but a structure that has completed its historical role. The psyche, like a living organism, cannot develop indefinitely in the same form. What once helped you adapt at one stage becomes an obstacle at another. If that obstacle is not removed consciously, it will be shattered through crisis. A clear metaphor is the molting of a crab. When its old shell becomes too tight, the crab cannot grow by clinging to it. It must find a safe place, separate itself from the familiar shell, endure a vulnerable, exposed phase before a new shell forms. From the outside, this is the most dangerous moment, but without it, growth would end. Psychological crisis operates by the same logic. It is the necessary gap between two forms of the self. What matters is that the crisis does not appear to strip away the capacity to think, but to force thinking to change levels. In earlier phases, think smart may have meant applying logic faster, analyzing more sharply, reacting more accurately. But when the psyche enters crisis, those tools are no longer sufficient. Thinking is no longer asked to solve problems immediately, but to tolerate uncertainty without retreating to old structures simply because they are familiar. This point is often misunderstood. Many believe that during a crisis, what is needed is to regain control as quickly as possible. Jung argued that this effort often prolongs the crisis because it attempts to rebuild the very structure that has collapsed. The psyche does not need you to patch up the old house. It needs you to allow a different foundation to form. And to do that, thinking must shift from control mode to observation mode. This process can be seen in the story of Anna, a woman who lived a stable, well-directed life. For many years, Anna built her life on consistent principles: how she loved, how she bonded, how she chose relationships, how she envisioned the future. Nothing was wrong, nothing dramatic happened. But then came a moment when the choices that once made her feel secure became empty. Each time she faced familiar decisions, Anna felt as though she was repeating a script that had lost its meaning. What unsettled her was not sadness, but the paralysis of thinking. Old reasons no longer convinced, while no new way of living had yet appeared. Anna thought she had lost clarity, but in truth, the old structure of herself was no longer sufficient to contain the person forming within. When she stopped forcing herself back into the familiar and allowed herself to remain with not knowing, a quiet shift began. The crisis did not destroy Anna's life. It simply revealed that her life had reached a point where it needed restructuring. In the Jungian frame, crisis is the moment when the psyche demands a new kind of honesty. Not honesty about emotions, but honesty about the limits of old definitions. You cannot stay calm by pretending everything is still fine. Calm here comes from accepting that you are in the middle of a restructuring process, where not knowing is a legitimate part of experience. This explains why during a crisis, critical thinking can become sharp in a different way. Instead of rushing to conclusions, you begin to notice questions that were once ignored. Instead of seeking quick answers, you see which assumptions need to be dismantled. Critical thinking at this stage is no longer reflex. It is the ability to remain still in the collapse of familiar patterns without immediately replacing them with new ones. Seen this way, crisis is not the opposite of stay calm. It is the condition for a deeper form of calm to emerge. Calm is no longer surface stability, but trust that the psyche knows what it is doing, even when consciousness does not yet understand the process. And think smart now means not thinking faster or more, but thinking slowly enough not to sabotage the transformation underway. When crisis is seen as a process rather than a deviation, it no longer demands immediate action or self-correction. It asks you to remain with the change that is forming. Like crossing a bridge under construction, you cannot run and you cannot turn back. You can only move slowly, keep your balance, and trust that there is ground on the other side. Paradoxically, it is in this stillness that thinking begins to regain its true strength. No longer pressured to defend old structures, it becomes more flexible, more precise, more honest with a changing reality. Crisis, in this light, is not the end of clear thinking. It is the threshold where thinking is reborn at a deeper level, more aligned with the person you are becoming. We have now reached a very particular point in this journey, where thinking no longer rushes forward, but must stop to make room for a new form taking shape. Thank you for being here, for not leaving quickly, for not seeking an immediate exit, but choosing to stay with the deeper layers of inner experience. Before continuing, take a brief moment. Breathe slowly, feel your body sitting still, and notice what inside you is settling. If what you have just heard resonates, if you find yourself in the state Jung described, not lost, but without answers yet, try leaving one word in the comments that best reflects your current experience. Shifting, quiet, forming, in between, or any word that comes naturally. Sometimes a single word named at the right moment is enough to mark an important threshold for yourself and perhaps for someone else quietly moving through a similar crisis. Number 10. The method of inner observation. Approaching the unconscious not to control it, but to understand it. So if not control, not suppression, and not emotional analysis, how does one approach the unconscious while remaining calm and clear? This question arises naturally after everything that has been laid bare. Once you see that the unconscious cannot be extinguished, that crisis is not deviation, and that thinking can be quietly hijacked, the usual effort to master the inner world begins to feel inadequate. Jung did not propose a method to control the unconscious, because for him, all attempts to control what lies beneath consciousness only create an illusion of power. Instead, he suggested a different attitude: observation. Not observation to fix, but observation to understand. In the Jungian approach, inner observation is not about sitting down and abstractly looking inward. It happens right in the midst of life, in the small reactions you usually overlook. Each time you react faster than necessary, each time you feel unusually certain, each time you repeat the same interpretation even though circumstances have changed, that is where the unconscious leaves its trace. Observation, in this sense, is the ability to recognize that a reaction that just occurred does not fully belong to the present. You do not rush to conclude or correct. You simply note that something has been activated. Jung wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. Human beings continually encounter themselves in countless forms throughout life. For this reason, the unconscious rarely appears as a clear thought. It reveals itself through more indirect forms, recurring patterns, meaningful coincidences, images that repeatedly surface in everyday experience. A key part of inner observation is tracking these living symbols. Symbols are not mystical. They are anything that carries more meaning than its surface suggests. A type of person who consistently triggers strong reactions, a seemingly harmless situation that repeatedly disorients you, or a decision you endlessly postpone without clear reason. These are not problems to solve immediately, they are data. Consider someone who feels irritated whenever there is a small change in family routines. Not major changes, just a later dinner or a postponed trip. On the surface, they may explain their reaction rationally, a dislike of disorder, a need for structure. But if observed over time, they may realize that the reaction lies not in the change itself, but in the rapid loss of orientation that follows. Jung would not ask, "Why aren't you more flexible?" He would ask, "What symbol is this change touching in your inner life?" When the question is placed correctly, reaction separates from action and thinking gains space. What matters here is not to interpret too quickly. Jung warned that rushing to assign meaning to the unconscious is often how the ego reasserts control. Jungian observation is not saying, this is because of X or Y, but allowing an image, reaction, or pattern to exist long enough for its structure to reveal itself. This requires a special kind of patience with ambiguity, and that patience is the foundation of a deeper stay calm. Not calm through control, but calm through not needing to rush. From a modern scientific perspective, this approach parallels research on metacognition, the ability to recognize one's own thinking processes. Observing reactions without immediately identifying with them activates higher-order processing in the brain, where information is evaluated rather than reflexively acted upon. Studies on executive function show that the ability to step outside a thought reduces cognitive bias and improves decision quality. Jung, without neuroscientific language, intuited this early on. Thinking becomes intelligent only when it has distance from the content flowing through it. Another subtle aspect of Jung's observational method is attention to repetition. Not major events, but small details that recur. An argument that always follows the same script. A familiar feeling that appears whenever you occupy a certain role. A thought that returns precisely when you're about to make an important decision. Jung saw these as signs that a deeper structure is seeking entry into consciousness. You do not need to act on them immediately. Recognizing that they exist is already a meaningful shift. Jungian inner observation also means learning to view life as a series of messages rather than a list of problems to solve. When something triggers a strong reaction, instead of asking, "How do I deal with this?" you can ask, "What in me has just been called?" This question is not meant to produce quick answers, but to slow habitual reflex. And it is precisely this slowing that allows thinking to become more flexible, less driven by preset conclusions. Importantly, this method does not make you passive. On the contrary, it creates a subtler form of agency. You act not from vague impulse, but from an increasingly clear understanding of your inner structure. When you recognize that a reaction does not belong to the present, you gain the freedom not to act on it immediately. When you see a symbol repeating, you can wait until it reveals enough meaning before deciding. This is where think smart appears not as a skill, but as the natural result of knowing where you stand within your inner current. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not against you, it is against being ignored. When you observe without judgment or coercion, the unconscious no longer needs to create intense disruption to be noticed. Extreme reactions gradually give way to subtler signals, and as signals become subtler, thinking gains the conditions to process them more accurately. Calm, in this sense, is not a goal you strive for, but a state that arises when inner conflict no longer dominates. Finally, Jung's method of inner observation does not promise immediate peace. It promises something else, gradual clarity. You do not control the unconscious, but you are no longer led by it in the dark. You do not resolve every inner conflict, but you know where your reactions are coming from. And in the most difficult situations, this simple yet profound knowing is what allows you to remain calm while making decisions that do not betray reality. At this point, stay calm is no longer about standing still in the storm, but about reading the current beneath the surface. And think smart is no longer about speed or sharpness, but about thinking from the right inner position. Number 11. Practical Story 2. The story of a woman who could not reach a conclusion. So what happens when a person no longer uses thinking to reach conclusions, but to recognize their own limits? Emily enters this story not as someone in crisis, but as a woman who appears entirely normal by social standards. She is 33, lives in a large city, has a stable job, a regular life, and a relationship of over 4 years with a partner considered suitable. No one around her sees signs of instability. Both families approve. Friends believe it is time to move forward. Even Emily herself believed this for many years. That is why her story does not begin with an event, but with a very small pause in thinking, so small that, if unnoticed, it would quickly be labeled indecision, lack of resolve, or fear of commitment. What confused Emily was not the question, should I get married or not, but the fact that she could no longer approach that question in the old way. Each time marriage was mentioned, her thinking neither opposed nor agreed. It simply stopped. Not because emotions surged, not because of anxiety or fear, but because the reasons that once made sense no longer carried weight. They were not wrong, but they were insufficient. And in that gap, Emily began to realize something she had never faced before. There are moments in psychological life when thinking does not break down. It refuses to continue serving a structure that has completed its role. From a Jungian perspective, this is a characteristic moment of transformation, quiet, undramatic, yet decisive. The psyche does not push Emily into action, nor does it give her a new answer. Instead, it withdraws energy from familiar patterns, rendering thinking unable to operate as before. If Emily had forced herself to think it through, she would have entered prolonged tension. But what is striking is that she did not. Instead of chasing answers, she began to notice the moment thinking stopped. This shift was subtle. Emily did not call it a method, nor believe she was doing something right. She simply noticed that whenever the future was defined within fixed frames, marriage, stability, a socially accepted trajectory, her thinking lost momentum, not only with marriage, but with any long-term closed-ended decision. She did not react, argue with herself, or try to explain. She simply noted, "Here, thinking cannot go further." And that very non-intervention created a calm unlike anything she had known. This calm was not a relief. It did not make the issue disappear. But it ended the inner battle between having to decide and being unable to decide. Jung believed that when consciousness stops forcing the psyche to answer in familiar ways, another order has the chance to form. Emily did not solve her problem. She suspended defining it as a problem. And in that suspension, thinking began to shift roles from a tool of control to a tool of observation. This observation did not take place in therapy, nor through complex inner analysis. It unfolded in everyday life. Emily began to notice ordinary situations repeating around her, prearranged plans that made her hesitate, choices everyone deemed reasonable that she could not enter. No intense emotions accompanied them, no memories surfaced. Only a strange consistency in thinking's refusal to close the future in the old way. For Jung, this is precisely the indirect language of the psyche, not to be explained immediately, but to be seen. Crucially, Emily did not rush to assign meaning to these signs. She did not conclude that the relationship was wrong, nor convince herself she was not ready. She understood only this: the structure that once helped her become stable, appropriate, and adaptable was no longer spacious enough to contain the person forming within. And crisis, in the Jungian sense, is the moment when this truth can no longer be avoided. Here, staying calm does not mean maintaining normality to reassure others. It is the ability not to panic when familiar thinking loses effectiveness. Emily did not force herself back into her old shape just to feel safe. She allowed the state of not knowing to exist as a legitimate part of psychological life. This calm did not make her more certain. It made her more honest with what was unfolding within. And that honesty laid the ground for a more intelligent form of thinking to emerge. Thinking smart, in Emily's case, no longer meant choosing the correct option, but recognizing when thinking was no longer neutral. Previously, her thinking worked efficiently because it aligned with foundational assumptions she never had to question. When those assumptions no longer matched the person she was becoming, thinking did not betray her, it stopped. And only when Emily did not force it back did critical thinking return, not to conclude, but to distinguish what belonged to old habits and what belonged to a changing reality. Emily's story reveals something essential in the Jungian spirit. Sharp thinking does not always lead to clear action. There are phases in life when the most intelligent thinking is knowing when to step back, not allowing emptiness to be filled with familiar answers, and not letting the fear of undecidedness drive you back into constricting forms. In such difficult moments, calm is not control, and intelligence is not speed. Emily has not decided, but more importantly, she no longer allows old patterns to decide for her. And at that point, staying calm and thinking smart are no longer separate skills, but two expressions of the same capacity: the ability to remain with the psyche's process of transformation without betraying it for temporary comfort. And when thinking no longer reaches familiar conclusions, the cause is not always deep inner transformation. Sometimes it comes from another, quieter force: the need to continue being the right person, in the right role, with the right image, aligned with expectations others have grown accustomed to seeing. Number 12. Persona. The mask that makes thinking lose its honesty. Persona, in Carl Jung's thought, is the social mask that helps an individual adapt and function within collective life, not a form of moral falseness. The problem arises only when a person identifies with that mask and allows it to dominate thinking, as Jung wrote. The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. In everyday life, very few people notice the moment when the persona begins to interfere with their thinking. It does not appear as a clear voice saying, "Pretend." It appears far more subtly, in the form of decisions that sound reasonable, arguments that flow smoothly, yet always lead in the same direction, protecting the image you have grown accustomed to performing. You do not think, "I must preserve my image." You think, "This isn't appropriate. This isn't the right time. I should behave more maturely." The language is polished, social and respectable, but the motive underneath is no longer neutral. Persona is like a well-fitted outfit you wear when you go out. The problem begins when you forget that you are wearing clothes and start believing that you are the clothes themselves. When this identification occurs, every decision must answer an implicit question: will this damage the image I am? And from that moment on, critical thinking, honest reflective thinking, begins to bend in ways that are very hard to detect. A helpful metaphor for persona is a glass mask. It is transparent, so you forget it is there. Others see you through that pane of glass, and you also see the world through it. Everything still appears clear on the surface, but just one small scratch is enough for the line of sight to refract. You no longer see things as they are, but as they need to be seen so the mask does not crack. And because the mask is transparent, you still believe you are looking directly at reality. In this context, stay calm is often misunderstood. Outwardly, people governed by persona often appear very composed. They speak carefully, react appropriately, rarely show confusion. But that calm does not come from inner order. It comes from not allowing any thought to deviate from the image being maintained. Calm becomes a social requirement, not an inner state. And it is precisely this confusion that causes thinking to gradually lose its honesty. Consider a very ordinary example. A woman working as a manager in a non-profit organization is widely regarded as always thoughtful, always considerate of the collective. She is used to seeing herself as someone who avoids conflict and does not put personal needs first. In an important meeting, she realizes that a decision about to be approved will have long-term negative consequences for the project. Her reason clearly sees the issue, but at the same time, another thought arises quickly. If she speaks up in opposition, she will become difficult, too rigid, not aligned with the team's spirit. She does not think she is afraid of losing her image. She thinks she is maintaining harmony, choosing a more appropriate moment. In the end, she remains silent. The decision passes. Months later, the project encountered exactly the problem she had foreseen. Looking back, she does not feel that her logic was wrong. She only feels a vague discomfort. Why did I see it and not speak? Here, her thinking did not lack information or analytical ability. What was distorted was the starting point of thought. The question was no longer, what is right for this situation, but what fits the image I am carrying? Persona had quietly steered the thinking process, while all arguments still sounded perfectly reasonable. And this is exactly what Jung warned about. Persona is most dangerous when it looks like morality, responsibility, or maturity. Another subtle point is that when persona dominates, people often confuse social consistency with inner honesty. You can be very consistent in the role you play, always strong, always stable, always agreeable, but that consistency does not guarantee that your thinking is honest with a changing reality. Critical thinking in Jung's spirit is not about maintaining a fixed stance, but about the ability to adjust perception when circumstances require it. Persona does the opposite. It needs you to preserve the image, even when the situation has changed. When thinking serves persona, a familiar phenomenon appears. You begin to rationalize instead of question. Instead of asking, "Why does this make me uneasy?" you quickly find reasons to justify silence, delay, or avoidance. Thinking becomes a tool of justification, no longer a tool of exploration. And because everything unfolds smoothly, appropriately, in character, you rarely realize how far you have drifted from your own honest center. Jung did not deny the value of persona. He understood that without this mask, people would struggle to exist in society. But he also emphasized that problems begin when persona occupies the entire space of consciousness. At that point, you are not only performing a role for others, you are performing it for yourself. You believe the story of who you are supposed to be so completely that you can no longer hear the subtle signals indicating that reality is asking for a different perspective. In difficult situations, think smart does not mean thinking in ways that offend no one, preserve appearances, or keep familiar roles intact. Think smart, for Jung, means the ability to recognize when your thinking has been pulled away from neutrality by social demands. It is the moment you dare to admit, "This argument sounds very reasonable, but what is it serving?" That single question is enough to strip persona of its absolute control. The paradox is that when you stop letting persona govern your thinking, you do not become less social. On the contrary, you become more authentic in your responses, clearer in your choices, and therefore more trustworthy in the long run. Calm now comes not from preserving an image, but from no longer having to constantly guard it. Inner space opens up, and within that space, thinking can perform its proper function: to understand, to distinguish, and to choose. This is also when people begin to notice a very subtle difference. Clarity does not come from having played the right role for many years, but from daring, for the first time, to see a situation without asking what it will do to one's image. Before closing this section, take a moment to look back at yourself. In recent difficult situations, have you ever noticed that you remained silent, agreed, or delayed, not because it was truly right, but because it helped preserve a familiar image? If so, you do not need to conclude or explain anything. Simply share in the comments a moment when you felt you saw it but didn't speak, or knew it but chose silence. Sometimes bringing that story into the light is already the first step toward more honest thinking. Number 13. Self, the higher center that guides essential decisions. When the mask has been seen and no longer unconsciously governs thinking, people often do not immediately find new answers. Instead, they enter a quieter, less dramatic state that nonetheless requires more courage. This is the space many rush to fill with action or explanation, because such silence is easily mistaken for passivity or retreat. Jung saw it not as disorientation, but as a sign that the psyche is beginning to reorganize around a different center. That center is not the ego, not a social role, but the self. In the Jungian model, the self is not an abstract philosophical idea, nor a higher ego in a moral sense. The self is the totality of the psyche, the deepest organizing principle that allows all other parts to find their proper place. If the ego is the center of consciousness, the self is the center of the entire psychological life, including both what has become conscious and what has not. Thus, when Jung speaks of the self as a centering force, he is not speaking of control, but of integration. At this level, functioning no longer takes the form of "I decide," but of "I am being placed back in alignment." Every element of the psyche, when not forced, naturally tends to arrange itself around this axis. This has a crucial implication for thinking in difficult situations. When a decision runs counter to the self, a person does not necessarily feel fear or suffering immediately. On the contrary, they often still feel fine, still rational, still in control. But beneath that apparent stability lies a constant inner tension. Energy must be expended to sustain the choice. Reassurance must be repeated. The more reasons are needed to stand firm, the more it signals that the inner axis is misaligned. Over time, this tension erodes calm and turns thinking defensive and rigid. Conversely, when a direction does not oppose the self, it may not bring immediate certainty, but it does not require constant effort to endure. This is a very subtle criterion Jung regarded as a sign of essential alignment. I once heard the story of Rachel, a woman in her 30s living a life widely considered successful and reasonable. Rachel worked in education, held a stable position, was trusted by colleagues, and loved by students. For many years, she believed her path was clearly defined. Then, without any specific crisis, she began to notice that every decision involving moving forward along the familiar track felt heavy. She could still explain why she should continue, still found the arguments entirely reasonable. But each time she thought about committing more deeply to her old role, her inner world seemed to tighten in order to agree. Notably, Rachel did not fall into emotional crisis. She was not sad, panicked, or disoriented in the usual sense. She noticed only something small yet consistent. Whenever she thought in terms of "what I should do," her thinking became rigid and exhausting. And whenever she allowed herself not to conclude, not to define the future prematurely, her body and mind softened. Rachel did not have new answers, but she had a clear signal about the degree of inner resistance. That signal gradually became her new point of reference for observation. In Jungian language, Rachel did not give up or go astray. She simply stopped resisting the centering pull of the self. The right decision in this case was not choosing a different option, but no longer forcing the psyche to maintain a form that no longer fit. The self did not tell Rachel what to do. It merely withdrew energy from old structures, making continuation difficult in a very precise way. And this precision is the expression of a deeper intelligence Jung believed existed beneath consciousness. Jung held that when people go against the self, the psyche creates obstacles, not as punishment, but to compel attention to the misaligned center. This may sound abstract, but modern science shows a clear parallel. Research on systemic coherence indicates that when individuals repeatedly make decisions that conflict with core values and deep identity, the nervous system expends more energy to maintain stability. Cortisol rises, regulatory capacity diminishes, thinking becomes defensive and less flexible. Conversely, when behavior aligns with inner orientation, the nervous system enters a higher state of synchrony, not because problems are solved, but because the system is no longer fighting itself, allowing clarity and calm to arise without effort. This reframes "stay calm, think smart" through the lens of the self. Calm is no longer understood as a skill of controlling reactions, but as a sign that you are not opposing yourself. Intelligent thinking is no longer about speed or sharp choices, but about discerning which thoughts arise from the need to preserve old structures, and which can emerge when the psyche is no longer under strain. When the self begins to occupy the center, thinking often slows down, yet becomes more precise and honest. This slowness is not stagnation. It is a rhythm appropriate to the depth of transformation underway. What must be emphasized here is this: the self never commands. It does not issue direct instructions or force action. The self reveals itself only through the degree of inner ease or resistance toward a given direction. At this stage of the process, what is required is not a decision, but the ability to continue observing without prematurely closing the experience. This is not the end point, but a threshold, where thinking begins to learn how to stand behind a deeper center, rather than trying to lead with familiar patterns. At this threshold, people begin to learn a different kind of listening, not seeking answers, not forcing direction, but recognizing the very slow rhythm of psychological life adjusting itself. Thinking does not yet need to have the final word. It only needs to be quiet enough not to obstruct the deeper axis forming. At this stage, not knowing is no longer a deficiency, but a necessary condition for a new structure to emerge authentically. Number 14. Jungian synthesis. Calm as a consequence, not a goal. Only at a certain point, when people no longer have to strain against their own inner movements, does a new understanding gradually appear, not as a logical conclusion, but as an image that becomes clear only when one steps back far enough to see the whole. Calm is not a skill to be trained, nor a state to be pursued. It arises naturally as a consequence when psychological life is no longer operating in tension and opposition. When thinking no longer has to fight unseen forces within, calm becomes evident, almost to the point of not needing to be named. Throughout this journey, Carl Jung never attempted to give people a formula for staying calm in difficult situations. He did something far subtler. He outlined the structure of psychological life as a living whole, where each element, once seen in its proper place, naturally reduces inner conflict. Parts once pushed into shadow, when recognized, no longer need to speak through impulsive reactions. Old patterns, once observed, gradually lose their power to silently steer thinking. Social roles, once return to their proper function, stop distorting decisions just to preserve a familiar image. And when a deeper axis of inner life begins to emerge, thinking naturally ceases to be pulled off course by structures that have completed their role. The core lies here. These movements do not occur in a linear sequence, nor do they exist as stages to be completed. They interweave, overlap, and influence one another like elements in an ecosystem. Shift one point in the structure, and the entire system begins to respond differently. In that change, calm does not appear as an effort or personal achievement, but as a natural sign that psychological life is finding its balance again. Seen this way, think smart is also redefined. Intelligent thinking in difficult situations is not quick reaction, sharp argumentation, or rigid emotional control. It is the ability to think without being hijacked. When the shadow no longer needs to hide, when a complex is not blindly triggered, when the persona is not standing in front like a mirror that must not crack, and when the self occupies the center, thinking becomes clear on its own. It does not need to prove, justify, or rush to conclusions simply to escape discomfort. Imagine someone facing a difficult conversation, such as giving honest feedback to a loved one or colleague. When the psyche is still full of unseen conflict, such a conversation easily becomes a site of reaction, avoidance, defensiveness, or saying what is appropriate but not inwardly true. The person may try to remain calm by choosing safe words and a steady tone, yet afterward feel drained, heavy, or constrained. By contrast, when inner structures have been reordered, the same conversation unfolds in a very different space. The person does not need to maintain calm. They speak more slowly, listen more clearly, and can adjust their words according to the real flow of the dialogue. Though the conversation remains difficult, they are not swept away by reaction. Calm here is not a strategy, but the result of no longer needing to defend oneself against oneself. This explains why Jung was always cautious of direct advice like stay calm, think positively, or control your emotions. For him, such advice touches only behavioral surface, while the real issue lies in the deeper structure of the psyche. If the structure has not been adjusted, any technique is temporary. If the structure has been adjusted, calm does not need to be mentioned. It arises as a baseline state. When the entire Jungian process is synthesized, a clear reversal emerges compared to common approaches today. Instead of asking, "How can I be calmer?" the core question becomes, "What in me is preventing calm from appearing?" Instead of trying to make better decisions under pressure, one learns to recognize the unseen forces distorting thinking before decisions form. And instead of treating calm as the final goal, one understands it as a signal that the inner system is operating harmoniously. At a deeper level, this also touches the essence of psychological maturity. A mature person is not someone who remains calm in every situation, but someone who is no longer surprised by their own reactions. They can recognize when an unconscious part is speaking, when an old pattern is trying to repeat, and when a social image is interfering with thinking. Because of this, they can pause before reaction becomes action and allow thinking to return to its proper function, to understand, distinguish, and choose with clarity. If the entire spirit of stay calm, think smart, in Jung's sense, were to be condensed into a single statement, it would be this: calm is the result of the absence of inner war, and intelligent thinking is the consequence of a psyche organized around its proper axis. There are no shortcuts here. No technique can replace the process of recognition, observation, and restructuring. And precisely for that reason, what is gained through this process is not temporary. At this closing point, what remains is not a call to action nor a checklist to follow. It is a different way of seeing yourself in difficult situations. When you notice that you are no longer swept into an excessive reaction, when thinking no longer has to prove its correctness, and when calm appears without effort, that is not luck. It is a sign that the various parts of the psyche have begun to stand in their proper places. And when that happens, stay calm is no longer a command, and think smart is no longer a pressure. They become two natural expressions of the same inner reality, a person living and thinking from within their own integrity. Looking back on the entire journey that Stay Calm, Think Smart, the art of critical thinking. In difficult situations, Carl Jung has just guided you through, you may have noticed something essential. Calm and clarity are not isolated skills to acquire, but the result of an inner order being restored. From recognizing unconscious reactions, distinguishing suppression from calm, clarifying the roles of ego, shadow, and persona, to encountering the self as a deeper axis of psychological life, you no longer stand at the same starting point as when this video began. Not because you know more, but because you now look differently at yourself. Jung did not teach you how to think faster under pressure, nor did he promise that difficult situations would disappear. What he showed is that most chaos does not come from circumstances, but from thinking being hijacked by unrecognized inner structures. When those structures are seen and reordered, calm does not require effort. It appears as a foundation, and upon that foundation, thinking becomes truly intelligent, not because it is sharper, but because it is no longer distorted. When you begin to live from that position, Stay Calm is no longer an instruction to follow, and Think Smart is no longer a pressure to perform. They become two natural expressions of the same thing, a psyche no longer at war with itself. You react more slowly, but more precisely. You speak less, but more truthfully. You no longer need to win in thinking, because you are no longer being possessed by thinking. If this video resonated with you, not as a new idea, but as a familiar recognition, share it with someone who may be caught between false calm and distorted thinking. And if you wish to continue this journey, the journey of learning to think from the right inner position, subscribe to accompany the videos ahead. Because when inner order is restored, you will no longer have to strive to be calmer or smarter. You will live as the natural consequence of that order. And in the most difficult situations, that is something nothing can take away from you.